My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm 42 years old, a wife, a mother of two, and for most of my adult life, I have been what you would call a good Christian. But 14 minutes of death changed everything I thought I knew about my faith. I always believed I had time. Time to slow down, time to really get serious about my walk with Christ, not just my work for Christ. But I was wrong. Death came for me in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in the parking lot of the very church I had given my life to, and what I saw on the other side will haunt me forever. For exactly 14 minutes, my heart stopped, and in those 14 minutes, I stood before Jesus Christ, and he revealed the hidden, respectable, and virtuous-looking trap that is dragging millions of sincere Christians in America straight toward an eternity they never expected. It wasn't a sin you would hear condemned from the pulpit. It wasn't drugs or murder or adultery. It was something so ordinary, so accepted, so applauded in our church culture that most believers, including me, defend it as a badge of honor every single day. I need you to stay with me, to listen with an open heart, because if you ignore this urgent message, you may, like I almost did, discover too late that your life of dedicated service was on the wrong path all along. Before that day, my life was a color-coded calendar. I was a supermom, a pillar of the church, the woman who could do it all. My days were a frantic, tightly scheduled blur of packing school lunches, leading the women's ministry, running my kids to soccer practice, and chairing the church building committee. I was a master of logistics, a CEO of family and faith, and I was proud of it. My busyness was my identity. It was my proof that I was a committed, sold-out follower of Christ. But if I were being honest, which I now have no choice but to be, my heart was slowly growing dull. Prayer felt more like a duty on a checklist than a passionate conversation. My Bible sat on my nightstand, a symbol of a faith I was too busy to actually cultivate. I was running on empty, and I didn't even know it. My life was a masterpiece of scheduling, a testament to the power of a well-managed calendar. I saw my life not in days or weeks, but in 15-minute, color-coded blocks on my phone screen. Green for the kids' schedules, blue for my husband's, yellow for household chores, and a vibrant, holy-looking purple for my church commitments. There was no white space. White space in my world was a sign of failure, a sign of time that wasn't being redeemed. I was a prisoner to the tyranny of my own calendar, and I called it a servant's heart. I justified my frantic pace with two unimpeachable excuses: my children and my church. I was convinced that being a good mother meant my children had to be in every possible activity: soccer, piano, advanced math club. I was driven by a deep cultural fear that if I didn't push them, if I didn't fill every moment of their lives with productive activity, they would fall behind. I was sacrificing my own peace on the altar of their future success. And the church was a black hole for my time, and I gave it willingly. The emails were relentless. We need volunteers for the nursery. Can someone lead the bake sale committee? We need 3 more teachers for VBS. And I, Sarah, the dependable one, the woman with the servant's heart, always said yes. I loved the feeling of being needed. I was addicted to the quiet praise, the "I don't know how you do it all, Sarah," that followed me in the church hallways. In my brutal honesty, which is all I have left now, I must admit it was a form of pride. My ability to juggle it all had become my identity. My worth was not in who I was in Christ, it was in what I did for Christ. My faith had become a to-do list. Quiet time, check, if you count the 5 minutes I prayed in the car between appointments. Bible study, check, I skimmed the lesson right before I taught it to the Sunday school class. Worship, check, I sang the songs loudly from the choir loft. I was mistaking activity for God with a relationship with God. I was Martha, frantic and busy with many things, and I had completely forgotten the one thing that was truly necessary: to simply sit at his feet. On that final Tuesday, my calendar was, as usual, a testament to my own self-importance. School drop-off, a conference call for work, volunteer shift at the school library, rush my son to soccer practice across town, and then race back to the church for a 6:00 p.m. building committee meeting that I was chairing. As I pulled out of the soccer field parking lot, I glanced at the clock. 5:48, I was running late. My mind was already on the meeting agenda, on the budget proposals. my foot pressed a little too hard on the gas. I had 100 things left to do that day, and I didn't have time for a single interruption. I certainly didn't have time to die. The minutes on the car clock seemed to mock me, each tick a small accusation of my poor time management. 5:51 p.m. 9 minutes to get across town, park, and walk into that committee, meeting with the calm, collected air of a woman who had her life perfectly under control. My phone was connected to the car's Bluetooth, and I was on a conference call with another volunteer about the upcoming bake sale, discussing the logistics of gluten-free options, while simultaneously trying to mentally review the first point on the building committee's agenda. My mind was a frantic spreadsheet of tasks, a whirlwind of responsibilities I had willingly, eagerly taken upon myself. Okay, I'll email you the final numbers after this meeting, I said into the air, my voice a mask of cheerful competence. Just have to get through this next thing first. I turned into the church parking lot, my tires squealing slightly as I took the corner too fast. And then it happened. It was not a gentle fatting. It was a sudden, violent, and absolute system failure. A sharp, searing pain exploded in the center of my chest, a pain so intense, so breathtakingly brutal, that it felt like my heart was being ripped in two. A strangled gasp escaped my lips, and my right hand flew to my chest, a useless, instinctive gesture. The phone call I was on, the agenda in my head, the bake sale, the soccer practice, it all vanished, incinerated in an instant by the white-hot agony that was now consuming me. My vision blurred. The familiar, comforting sight of my church steeple, visible through the windshield, smeared into a meaningless streak of white. My foot, which had been pressed to the accelerator, went limp, then spasmed, slamming down hard on the gas pedal. The car lunged forward, a 2-ton weapon I was no longer in control of. I heard a scream, a high-pitched sound of pure terror, and I distantly realized it was my own. The world tilted, a chaotic blur of asphalt and brick as the car careened toward the church's main building. I remember the sound of the impact, a deafening, grinding crunch of metal against brick. My chest slammed against the steering wheel, the force of it a final, brutal punctuation mark on a life of constant forward motion. And in that last, terrible second, a single, clear, and tragically ironic thought pierced through the pain and the chaos. I am going to be late for my meeting. And then nothing, blackness, silence. The silence of the void was brief. My awareness returned not to a place of peace, but to the scene of my own failure. I was floating, weightless, near the roofline of the church, looking down at the chaos I had created. Flashing red and blue lights from the first ambulance painted the parking lot in frantic, strobing colors. I saw my friends from the building committee, the ones who had been waiting for me inside, running out of the church, their faces masks of horror. They were surrounding my crushed car, which was now pressed up against the brick wall of the youth wing. I saw the paramedics smashing the driver's side window and carefully, urgently, pulling my limp body from the driver's seat. And in that moment, my first coherent thought was not of my own life or death. It was not of eternity, it was of the agenda. Oh no, my soul panicked, a frantic, silent scream, the meeting. The budget reports are on my laptop in the passenger seat. They can't start the meeting without the reports. I tried to shout, to point, to tell someone to get the laptop, but I had no voice, I had no hands. Then another, more terrible thought hit me, my son. His soccer practice ended at 6:30. Who was going to pick him up, had I remembered to put it on the shared family calendar? The panic rose in me like a tidal wave. This was a logistical nightmare. Everything was falling apart. My perfectly managed world, my color-coded calendar of responsibilities, was collapsing because of this terrible, inconvenient interruption. I was so consumed with the chaos of my undone to-do list that it took me a full minute to process the truth. I looked down at my own body being placed on a stretcher. My skin was a pale, waxy gray. My chest was not moving. And a paramedic was placing a white sheet over my face. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was dead. But even that realization was filtered through the lens of my frantic, planning mind. Dead, I can't be dead. I have a meeting, I have to pick up my son. I have to plan the vacation Bible school fundraiser for next month. I was a soul separated from its body, but my mind was still utterly and completely trapped in the tyranny of my calendar. The terror that finally consumed me was not the fear of judgment. It was the terror of a control freak who had just lost all control. As the scene below began to fade, as I felt a gentle but firm pull away from the world of my responsibilities, I was still screaming in silent, anxious protest. No, not yet, I have too much to do. The frantic chaos of the church parking lot dissolved, not into a tunnel of light, but into a profound and unnerving stillness. I was no longer falling or being pulled. I was simply there. I was in a place I can only describe as the great in-between. It wasn't dark, but it wasn't light either. It was a vast, featureless, and infinite expanse of gray, like being inside a thick fog that had no top and no bottom. But the most terrifying part of this place was the silence. My entire adult life had been a symphony of noise, the constant ping of notifications on my phone, the overlapping schedules of my children, the buzz of church committee meetings, the worship music I played in the car to drown out my own anxious thoughts. I had used noise and activity as a shield, a wall to keep me from the quiet places in my own soul, and now that wall was gone. The silence here was absolute, a perfect, heavy, and deafening stillness that pressed in on me from all sides. It was unbearable. For an addict deprived of her drug, this silence was my personal hell. My soul screamed for a distraction, for a task to complete, for a problem to solve. The agenda my mind frantically searched. The bake sale, I need to pick up my son. But my to-do list was gone. My identity as Sarah Jenkins, the woman who did it all, was meaningless here. Stripped of my busyness, I was nothing, and in that nothingness, I began to feel a new sensation. The air itself seemed to weigh on me, a heavy, scrutinizing pressure, as if I was being measured, evaluated. Then the silent film of my life began to play, not for a heavenly audience, but just for me. It wasn't a highlight reel of my greatest sins. It was far more subtle and far more damning. I was shown 1,000 moments of my own absence. I saw myself at the dinner table with my family, my daughter trying to tell me about her day, while I nodded along, my mind 1,000 miles away, mentally planning the logistics for the upcoming church retreat. I saw myself in the sanctuary, singing a song of worship, my hands raised, my face a perfect mask of piety, while my inner monologue was a frantic checklist of the errands I needed to run after the service. I was shown every time I had chosen the urgent over the important, every time I had sacrificed the presence of my family and the presence of my God on the altar of my own productivity. It wasn't a record of what I had done wrong. It was a record of all the times I had simply not been there. In that unbearable, all-seeing stillness, stripped of my schedules and my service, I had never felt so naked, so empty, so completely and utterly known. And then I felt a presence, and I knew I was about to be judged. In the heart of that all-seeing stillness, the presence I felt began to manifest. The endless, featureless gray void was pierced by a light so brilliant and so pure it was terrifying. And from the center of that light he appeared. I must be very clear. This was not the soft, gentle, painted figure from children's Bibles. This was not the meek and mild Jesus I had sung about in the choir. This was the Jesus of Revelation, a king and a judge awesome in his majesty. His eyes blazed like a refining fire, a gaze that did not just see me, but saw through me, burning away every excuse, every justification, every carefully constructed image I had ever hidden behind. His voice, when it came, was not a whisper, but thundered with the sound of many rushing waters, a sound of such unbearable power that it seemed to shake the very foundations of this in-between place. And yet, wrapped within that terrifying power was an irresistible love, a love so profound that it was the only thing holding my terrified soul together. I collapsed to my spiritual knees, my entire being shaking with a holy fear. The supermom, the competent committee chair, the woman who was always in control, she was gone. I was undone, a flawed and frantic creature in the presence of pure, unadulterated holiness. My first thought was a cry of pure, accurate self-assessment. I don't belong here. He spoke my name, Sarah. The sound of it was like thunder and a whisper all at once, a roar of authority that shook me to my core, and a gentle call that wrapped me in a love I did not deserve. In a desperate, last-ditch effort to prove my worth, I began to stammer out my spiritual resume, the checklist of my busy life. Lord, I pleaded, I tried to serve you. I went to church every Sunday. I sang in the choir. I taught the children. I prayed with my kids. He simply raised a hand, and my frantic, foolish words died in my soul. His eyes of fire pierced me deeper than any words ever could. Sarah, his thought entered my mind, a declaration that was both a rebuke and a new commission. There is something I must show you. Something that is destroying my people. Something you, in your service, have been completely blind to. Tears of confusion welled in my eyes. Lord, what do you mean? I stammered. I don't steal, I don't commit adultery, I don't kill. He shook his head slowly, his expression one of profound, sorrowful gravity, and the words he spoke next were the beginning of my true and terrible education. The enemy's greatest victory is not found in the sins my people easily recognize. It is in the sin they defend as harmless, the one they even celebrate as a virtue. His final words, the sin they defend as a virtue, hung in the air, a terrible and confusing riddle. Suddenly, the gray, in-between space around us dissolved, not into a vision of earth, but into a symbolic reality, a place that was a perfect and horrifying representation of the very trap he was describing. I was standing in a massive, infinite hall. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling as far as I could see, were covered in clocks, millions of them. Grandfather clocks, digital clocks, ornate mantel clocks, simple kitchen clocks, and tiny wristwatches, all ticking, all ringing, all buzzing, and all of them were spinning wildly, uncontrollably. The hands were a frantic blur, the digital numbers a flashing, meaningless cascade. The air was not silent. It was a deafening, maddening cacophony of a billion ticks and a million alarms, all shrieking at once, a symphony of perpetual, unrelenting urgency. And the hall was not empty. It was filled with countless people, people I recognized as believers. They looked like the men and women from my own church, my own community, but they were not at peace, they were running. They were in a state of frantic, breathless panic, rushing from one spinning clock to another, trying to adjust the hands, trying to silence the alarms, their faces pale with exhaustion and lit by the stressful, flickering glow of the time they could not control. They were prisoners in a hall of their own making, slaves to the relentless ticking that drove them forward. I saw a mother, her face a mask of anxiety, trying to juggle 3 different spinning clocks at once, each one labeled with her children's activities. I saw a pastor, his face gray with exhaustion, running on a massive treadmill trying to keep a dozen different clocks, each labeled with a different church program, from ringing all at once. I watched them, my heart filled with a strange pity and then a dawning horror because I recognized the feeling in the air. I knew this frantic, joyless, and soul-crushing rush. This wasn't a vision of some strange, other world. This was a vision of my own heart. This was my life. This was the virtue of busyness, the idol of productivity, the trap of mistaking activity for anointing. Jesus stood beside me, a single, solitary point of perfect stillness in the midst of the chaos. Watch Sarah, his thought was a quiet sorrow in the deafening noise. Watch and see the virtue they defend. The idol they praise, the trap they call faithfulness. The mystery he had presented at the beginning of my journey was now solved, and the answer was the very thing I had been most proud of. I looked at the exhausted, frantic souls running in circles, serving the tyranny of their own schedules, and I wept, because I was one of them. As I wept in horror at the recognition of my own life in that frantic, chaotic hall, Jesus opened my spiritual eyes a little wider. You see their frantic work, Sarah. His thought was a quiet, piercing light in the noisy darkness. Now see their cruel masters. And then I saw them. Moving among the running, exhausted believers were other figures. They were not monsters with horns and tails. They were far more subtle and far more terrifying than that. They were like shadowy, efficient foremen, cruel taskmasters with spiritual clipboards and stopwatches, their forms radiating a cold, impatient, and demanding energy. They were the source of the relentless urgency in the room. They were the demons of busyness. They weren't torturing these souls with whips or fire. Their torture was far more insidious. It was the torture of the whisper. I watched as one of these taskmasters glided up to a young mother who looked just like me, her face etched with anxiety as she tried to juggle the spinning clocks of her family's schedule. The demon leaned in and hissed a lie directly into her soul. A good mother never rests. If you stop, if you slow down, your children will fall behind. Their success is your responsibility. I saw the woman's shoulders slump with an even greater weight, and she began to run faster. I saw another taskmaster approach the exhausted pastor on the spiritual treadmill. It whispered its own tailored poison. The growth of this church depends on you. Look at the numbers. If you take a day off, if you dare to rest, this whole thing will fall apart. Your worth to the kingdom is measured by your weekly attendance. The pastor, already gasping for breath, pushed himself to run harder, his face a mask of desperate, joyless service. The taskmasters were everywhere, moving through the crowd, delivering their demonic performance reviews. You're not doing enough. Your worth is in your work. If you rest, you will be forgotten by God and by men. Your activity is your anointing. As I listened to this chorus of lies, a new wave of horror washed over me, a horror of self-recognition that was even more profound than before. These were not foreign whispers. These were the very same truths I had told myself for 20 years. This was the voice of my own internal monologue, the voice that drove me from one committee meeting to the next, the voice that filled me with guilt every time I tried to sit still. I realized with a clarity that shattered my soul that the voice I thought was my own ambition, my own dedication, my own servant's heart, was not my voice at all. I had been listening to and obeying a demonic taskmaster my entire Christian life. I saw that the enemy didn't need to tempt me with obvious, ugly sins. He had simply enslaved me with good things. And I understood, with a clarity that broke my heart, what this frantic, joyless activity was truly producing in the souls of God's people. I understood now that the frantic, joyless energy that had driven my life was not my own, but the whisper of a cruel, spiritual taskmaster. As I stood with Jesus, a point of perfect calm in the chaotic hall of spinning clocks, he began to give me the divine diagnosis for this sickness. He showed me a vision within the vision. I saw a young woman, her heart on fire for God, the day she first gave her life to Christ. Her soul was like a patch of rich, fertile soil, and I saw the seed of the gospel, a single, brilliant point of light being planted within her. It was beautiful, but then I watched as the thorns began to grow. The thorns were not literal plants, the thorns were clocks. A clock labeled mortgage payment grew up and wrapped around the light. Another labeled kids' soccer schedule shot up beside it. Then came more: work promotion, church committee, social media feed. They were all the good, normal, and necessary cares of this world. But they grew so fast, so thick, and so demanding that they began to choke the tender shoot of faith. I watched in sorrow as the brilliant point of light grew dimmer and dimmer, starved of the attention and stillness it needed to grow, until it was just a faint, struggling ember, buried beneath a thicket of relentless, worldly demands. The enemy does not always need to uproot the seed, Sarah, Jesus's thought was a sorrowful commentary. He often just needs to distract it to death. This is the faith choked by the cares of this world. The vision shifted again. I was no longer in the great hall, but in a small, dusty home in Bethany 2,000 years ago. I saw a woman, Martha, rushing around, her face a mask of stress and anxiety, a whirlwind of frantic service. Her expression was the exact same joyless, burdened expression I had seen on the faces of the believers in the Hall of Clocks, the same expression I saw in my own mirror every morning. Then I saw her sister, Mary, sitting silently at the feet of Jesus, doing nothing productive, nothing measurable, nothing that could be put on a to-do list. She was simply being present, her gaze fixed on him, her heart completely and totally available to him. I felt the familiar frustration of Martha. Doesn't she know there is work to be done? But Jesus's thought gently corrected me, just as he had corrected Martha then. I love Martha's heart of service, he explained. But her service became her source of anxiety, her distraction from me. She was so busy working for me that she had no time to simply be with me. Mary chose the one thing that is truly necessary. And then he gave me the final, devastating diagnosis, a truth that cut through my lifetime of justification. They have all become Marthas, he said, his gaze sweeping across the millions of frantic souls in the great hall. They have convinced themselves that the greatest expression of their love for me is in what they do for me. But they have forgotten that the one thing I desire most is not their service, but their heart. Not their activity, but their attention. I finally understood the disease, but I was not prepared to see the devastation it was leaving in its wake. I understood the disease. I saw myself and my entire community running frantically in that terrible hall of spinning clocks. But Jesus then showed me the devastation that this sickness was leaving in its wake. Now you must see the fruit of this busyness. His thought was heavy with grief. The vision shifted. I was no longer in the symbolic hall, but was now an invisible witness to a series of heartbreaking scenes on earth. First, I saw a pastor, a good man I recognized from a large church in a nearby city. He was sitting alone in his office late at night, his head in his hands, surrounded by books he no longer had time to read. In the physical realm, he looked tired, but in the spiritual realm, I saw his soul. It was a barren, cracked desert, a land that had been overfarmed and was now producing nothing but dust. I could hear his silent, desperate prayer, "Lord, I'm so tired. I have nothing left to give. Where are you?" Jesus explained he became so consumed with managing the programs of the church that he forgot to be a shepherd to its people and a child to me. His ministry is a great success, but his soul is withering. The scene dissolved and reformed. I was in the kitchen of a beautiful suburban home. A Christian husband and wife, people I knew from my own small group, were standing over a massive whiteboard calendar, a chaotic matrix of their children's activities, their own work schedules, and their church commitments. They were talking, but their conversation was not that of lovers. It was that of two stressed-out business partners. "Okay, you pick up Emily from ballet at 5:00. That gives me a 30-minute window to drop off the casserole for the Smiths before I have to be at the elders' meeting at 6:00. In the spiritual realm, I saw a cold, gray chasm of distance between them. They were so busy building a good Christian family that they had no time or energy left to simply be a husband and wife. The enemy did not need to tempt them with adultery, Jesus explained sadly. He just needed to fill their lives with so many good things that there was no room left for the best thing, each other. Their marriage is dying a slow, respectable, and busy death. Then he showed me the most devastating fruit of all. I saw a teenager, the son of that same busy couple, packing his bags for college. His parents were giving him a list of churches to check out in his new city. After they left the room, I was allowed to hear the boy's thoughts, and they broke my heart. "I can't wait to get away from all this," he thought, looking at a picture of his family. "My whole life, church has just been another thing on the schedule, another place to be rushed to, another performance. I've watched my parents run themselves into the ground, stressed and joyless, all in the name of serving God. If that's what being a Christian is, I don't want any part of it." He wasn't rejecting God. He was rejecting the miserable, exhausting, and unappealing religion he had witnessed his entire life. The fruit of his parents' frantic busyness was a lost generation. I finally understood the devastation, but I still didn't understand the larger purpose. You have seen the fruit of this deception. Jesus' thought was now a solemn introduction to an even deeper truth. Now you must understand the enemy's grand strategy. You must see why a busy church is a defeated church. The vision of the heartbroken teenager, a casualty of his parents' well-intentioned but joyless religion, faded. I was left with a profound sense of waste, of a generation being lost not to overt evil, but to a distracted and exhausted church. Now you must understand the enemy's grand strategy. The voice of Jesus was now that of a divine general, pulling back the curtain on the spiritual war. You must see why a busy church is a defeated church. The scene shifted, and he showed me a vision of his church, but it was portrayed as a great and mighty army encamped within a strong fortress. First, he showed me what the army was meant to be. I saw soldiers who were alert, their eyes on the horizon, watching for the enemy. They were in constant communication with their commander. Their weapons were sharp, and they moved with a sense of quiet, powerful purpose. But then the vision changed to the current state of that same army. the soldiers were no longer on the battlements. They were all inside the fortress, and they were incredibly, frantically busy. I saw legions of them running in circles, their faces etched with stress. Some were endlessly polishing their own armor until it gleamed, obsessed with their outward appearance. Some were constantly rearranging the supplies in the storehouses, holding meeting after meeting about the most efficient way to stack the provisions. Others were running endless, pointless drills in the courtyard, exhausting themselves with activity that had no real combat application. They were a perfect image of productivity. They were a model of efficiency, and they were utterly, completely, and dangerously unprepared for a real war. The enemy is wise in his own dark way, Jesus explained, his voice a sorrowful diagnosis of the battle. He knows he cannot destroy my church by a frontal assault. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. So his primary strategy is not destruction, but distraction. He showed me the demonic taskmasters I had seen before, but now I saw their true mission. Their goal was to fill the lives of these soldiers with so many good, urgent, and important-looking tasks that there would be no time or energy left for the few things that actually mattered. I watched as a soldier, after a long day of running drills and attending logistics meetings, would fall into his bunk, too exhausted to pray with any real focus. I saw another whose mind was so filled with the noise of strategies and programs that he no longer had the quiet space to hear the commander's voice. They have become so busy with the work of the house that they have no time for the master of the house, Jesus stated, and that single truth laid the entire strategy bare. He has tricked them into believing that their activity is their devotion. He has convinced them that a full calendar is a full heart. A busy church is a distracted church. A distracted church is a prayerless church. And a prayerless church, for all its impressive programs, for all its noise and all its motion, is an utterly powerless church. It is an army that has forgotten how to fight. I saw the terrible, simple genius of it. The enemy didn't need to defeat them. He just had to keep them busy until the very end. You have seen the strategy. His voice now grew heavy with a final, terrible gravity. Now you must see the final result of this great deception. You must see what happens when my powerless, distracted people stand before a holy and powerful God. The horrifying truth of the enemy's strategy, to neutralize the church through distraction, left me cold. The vision of the busy but powerless army faded, and the scene around me shifted into the most solemn and terrifying reality I had yet witnessed. The gray, in-between space was gone, as was the hall of spinning clocks. I was now standing before the great white throne of judgment. The sheer, unadulterated holiness that emanated from it was a physical force, a pressure that made my very soul feel transparent and utterly exposed. A vast crowd of souls stood before the throne, their faces not defiant, but filled with a frantic, pleading confusion. And a new wave of horror washed over me, because these were not the people I expected to see at such a judgment. They were not murderers, thieves, or atheists. They looked like me. They were the respectable people, the churchgoers, the committee members, the Sunday school teachers, the dedicated volunteers. A chorus of desperate voices rose from the crowd, not in worship, but in a panicked, defensive plea. They were holding up their lives of service, their packed schedules, their spiritual resumes as evidence for their salvation. "Lord, Lord," one cried out, a man who looked like a respected elder. "Didn't we chair the building committee in your name and raise the funds for the new sanctuary?" "Lord," another voice, a woman who looked so much like me, pleaded. "Didn't we run the vacation Bible school for 20 years? Didn't we organize the meals for the sick and keep all the church programs running, all in your name?" They were not holding up the cross, they were holding up their calendars. They were pointing to their activity, their busyness, their service as proof of their devotion. I watched, my heart pounding, as Jesus, seated on the throne, looked out over this crowd of busy, respectable, and lost souls. His face was not filled with rage, but with a sorrow so deep it was an agony to behold. And when he spoke, his voice was a thunder of perfect, heartbreaking justice. "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord,'" he declared, his words echoing the very scripture I had taught but never truly understood. "But I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. He then looked at them, his eyes of fire seeing not their impressive service, but their neglected hearts. Depart from me, you who were so busy with the works of my house that you never took the time to know the master of the house. The words hit them like a bolt of lightning, their faces contorting in a final, eternal agony of realization. They had been so focused on their service for him that they had never cultivated intimacy with him. And in that moment, the vision became personal. A horror unlike anything I had ever known pierced my soul, because as I looked at the crowd of the condemned, I saw my own face among them, my mouth forming the same desperate, useless pleas. I saw myself holding up my color-coded calendar, pointing to my endless committee meetings, my frantic volunteering as proof of my faith. And I knew, with a certainty that was like a second death, that if I had not been shown this truth, this would have been my eternal fate. The vision vanished, but the truth of it was seared into my soul. I was a Martha, destined to be turned away. And I wept, my heart finally breaking, not for the state of the church, but for the state of me. The vision of the great and terrible judgment vanished, but the horror of it was seared into my soul. I was on my knees, a weeping, broken mess in the presence of a holy God, utterly convinced of my own guilt. I was a Martha, and I had just been shown the tragic end of a life of anxious, distracted service. Lord, I whispered my soul a single, desperate cry. What can your people do? How do we escape this trap? His gaze, which had been so full of the fire of judgment, now softened with the compassion of a physician offering a cure. They must choose, he said, the thought a clear and simple prescription. They cannot serve both me and the idol of their schedule. They cannot be both a frantic servant and a beloved child at rest. He was not calling his people to a life of laziness or irresponsibility. He explained, I am not calling them to abandon their service, but to have their service flow from their stillness with me, not replace it. To show me, he gave me a series of beautiful and powerful countervisions. I saw a family on a Saturday morning. The parents, who I recognized as some of the frantic runners from the Hall of Clocks, had made a radical choice. Their children were not in any scheduled activities. The family calendar for the day was a blank, white, glorious space. They were simply taking a walk together in a park, their phones put away, laughing and talking, being present with each other. And I could feel the profound, healing peace that was settling over their home. The vision shifted. I saw the burned-out pastor from before, but this time it was his day off and he was not secretly answering emails. He was sitting by a lake, his Bible open in his lap, a fishing pole in the water beside him. He was doing nothing productive. He was simply being still, listening, letting the beauty of God's creation heal his weary soul. And in the spiritual realm, I saw his desert-like heart begin to receive a gentle rain, and a single, small green shoot of joy began to sprout. Then he showed me the most powerful vision of all. I saw a young mother, a woman just like me, in her kitchen. Her to-do list was a mile long, the phone was ringing. The demands of her busy life were screaming for her attention. I saw her look at the list, then at the phone, and then she made a choice. She deliberately turned the phone's ringer off, made a cup of tea, and sat down in a quiet corner of her home, opening her Bible. It was a small, hidden, and seemingly unproductive act, but in heaven, it was a thunderous declaration of war against the tyranny of the urgent. She was choosing the one thing necessary. The narrow road has always required sacrifice, Jesus said, as the visions faded. But the sacrifice I desire most is not your time or your energy. It is your attention, it is your heart. What looks like a loss of productivity to the world is eternal gain in my kingdom. His words burned into my heart. This was no longer just a vision, it was a command. And as I accepted it, the visions vanished and I heard distant voices calling my name. The voices grew louder, pulling me from the holy presence of Jesus, from the beautiful visions of a life of peace. I felt a heavy physical gravity take hold of my soul, dragging me downward, away from the light, back toward the noise and the pain of the world. The visions vanished. A rushing sound filled my ears, and I felt a crushing pressure on my chest. A violent rush of air, hot and painful, forced its way into my lungs. My eyes snapped open. I was not in heaven. I was staring up at the harsh, sterile fluorescent lights of a hospital ceiling. Doctors and nurses surrounded me, their faces a blur of urgent motion. A machine beside me was beeping a steady, insistent rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that was now my own. My husband, Mark, was clutching my hand, his face a mess of tears and disbelief. "Sarah, you're back," he cried, his voice cracking. "Oh my God, Sarah, you're back." I was back, and my first conscious thought, I am ashamed to tell you, was not one of gratitude or awe. My eyes darted frantically around the room until I found what I was looking for, a clock on the wall. My heart seized with a familiar, anxious panic. 7:15 p.m. My meeting started over an hour ago. My son who picked up my son. My to-do list, the tyrant I had served my whole life, was my very first thought upon returning from the dead. And in the next instant, the full, crushing weight of what I had just been shown came crashing down upon me. The hall of spinning clocks, the demonic taskmasters, the vision of the great judgment, the sorrowful eyes of Jesus. The truth of my own busy, distracted, and powerless faith. And I couldn't stop weeping. It wasn't from the pain in my chest, which was immense. Mark and the nurses thought I was crying from the trauma, from the relief of being alive, but they were wrong. I was weeping from the sheer, overwhelming force of my own conviction. I had just been shown my own potential damnation, a hell made not of fire, but of a frantic, joyless, and godless productivity. And my first thought upon being rescued from it was to worry about a committee meeting. The sickness was deeper than I could have ever imagined. The doctors kept calling my survival a miracle. They couldn't believe I had been dead for 14 minutes with no brain damage. But I knew the real miracle wasn't that my physical heart had restarted. The real miracle was that, for the first time in 20 years, my soul was finally learning how to be still. It has been a year since that day in the church parking lot, a year since I died and was reborn. My life is almost unrecognizable now. I resigned from 2 of the 3 committees I was on. I pulled my children out of half of their extracurricular activities. My calendar, which was once a chaotic tapestry of purple, green, and blue, now has something I never thought possible: white space, quiet stillness. Some of my friends from church don't understand. They think I've lost my passion, that I've stepped back from serving the Lord. They don't realize that for the first time in my adult life, I have finally begun to truly serve Him. Friend, I am telling you my story because I beg you, do not ignore this warning as I once did. That innocent, respectable, and even celebrated busyness that you wear as a badge of honor is not neutral. It is not a sign of your importance or your devotion. It is a brilliant and insidious strategy of the enemy. It is a trap. It is either drawing you into a deeper, quieter intimacy with Jesus, or it is dragging you, step by frantic step, into a life of powerless, prayerless, and joyless distraction. It is either your testimony or your tyrant. There is no middle ground. So I ask you to look at your own life, at your own heart. Ask yourself, is my life a worship service or just a to-do list? Is my calendar a tool that I use or a master that I serve? Am I a Martha, anxious and troubled about many things, while my soul is starving for the one thing that is truly needed? If this message has stirred something in your heart, I am pleading with you, act now. Don't just scroll away to the next thing on your feed. Eternity is at stake, your soul is at stake, the choice is yours. Comment "I choose rest" below if you will commit, right now, to putting your relationship with Him before your activity for Him. And please share this video to warn the busy, tired, and exhausted people you love before it's too late.